The Cheongsam was the color of rain clouds before a storm, gray silk with a high collar that Su Yun had sewn herself 3 years ago, back when her hands still shook doing it, back when everything about her life had needed sewing back together. She wore it every Sunday to the small clapboard church at the edge of Prosperity Creek, Nevada, and every Sunday since April, a cowboy named Silas Boone had fallen into step beside her on the walk home. She was 24 years old and a widow, and in the territory of 1878, those two facts together meant something specific to the people of Prosperity Creek. It meant she ran the small laundry and mending shop her husband had left her, alone, with debts that took most of what she earned. It meant she nodded at the women in town, and they nodded back, careful, the way you nod at something you have not decided how to feel about yet. It meant she walked to church alone and expected to walk home alone. But Silas Boone had other ideas, and he had never once asked her permission for them. "You keep walking me home," she said that Sunday in June, the dust of the road catching gold in the late morning light, "and folks are going to start talking." "Maybe I like the company," Silas said, and did not slow his pace, and did not look at her when he said it, which was how she had learned to tell when he meant something all the way down. Su Yun did not answer that. She had learned in the 8 months since Enoch Larkin was found dead in Prosperity Creek's feed store with a bad heart and a ledger full of debts she did not know he had, that silence was often the safest answer a woman in her position could give. She did not yet know that by the end of that summer, the silence would cost her almost everything, and the man walking beside her in his sun-bleached hat would be the one thing standing between her and losing the shop her husband had left her. Silas Boone was 31, and he worked the Halloran Ranch 6 miles east of town, breaking horses for wages that came slow and stayed thin. He was not a rich man. He was not, by any measure, the town of Prosperity Creek used to measure men, a particularly notable one. He had scarred knuckles from rope burns and a limp in his left leg from a horse that had thrown him 2 winters back, and he spoke rarely, and when he did speak, people tended to listen because he did not waste the words. He had first noticed Su Yun the way a man notices a person doing something difficult without complaint. She had been outside the mercantile in March, hauling a crate of dry goods too heavy for her frame, and the crate had split, and half the town had watched her kneel in the dirt gathering spilled flour with her bare hands rather than ask a single soul for help. Silas had not offered help either. He had simply knelt down across from her and started gathering flour into his own hat, and neither of them had said a word about it, and that had been the whole of their first conversation. By April he was walking her home from church. By May the town had noticed, and by June Prosperity Creek had begun to talk, the way small towns always talk, in low voices over shop counters and in glances that lasted a beat too long. "Mrs. Sue ought to know better," said Constance Wardell, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the moral compass of the town, though she had appointed herself to the position without a single vote. A woman in her situation, walking with a man like that, unmarried, in broad daylight, twice on a Sunday. "He's only walking her home," said her husband Otis, who did not much care for gossip, but had learned long ago that arguing with Constance only fed the fire. "That's how it starts," Constance said, and went back to her mending, though her eyes stayed on the window every Sunday after that, watching the road. Su Yun knew what was said about her. She had lived in Prosperity Creek for 6 years, since she and her husband, Winbo Sue, had come west from San Francisco with the promise of a laundry business and a fresh start. And in that time she had learned that being watched was simply the cost of being different in a town where difference was rare. She had learned to keep her back straight and her voice even and her opinions to herself, because a Chinese woman alone in a frontier town could not afford the luxury of being seen as difficult. The shop itself sat at the end of Prosperity Creek's short main street, a narrow, clapboard building with a lean-to washroom built onto the back, steam rising from copper pots most days of the week, lines of drying shirts strung between posts in the small yard. It was not much to look at, but it was hers, deeded in her name after Winbow's death through a quiet arrangement with the territorial clerk that Otis Wardell had helped broker, back before any of this trouble began, simply because he had thought it the decent thing to do for a widow with no sons to inherit through. That deed was the only thing standing between Sue Yun and complete dependency on the goodwill of a town that had never fully decided whether it wanted her there. She rose before dawn most mornings to heat the wash water, and worked until the light went from the sky, and ate her meals standing at the counter more often than not. And in 6 years she had built a business steady enough to keep her fed and clothed, and quietly, carefully independent, which was more than most widows in the territory could claim. She had told herself independence was enough. She had told herself she did not need more than that. But she had not learned, in 6 years, how to stop her chest from going warm and strange when Silas Boone fell into step beside her, and that unsettled her more than any gossip Constance Wardell could produce. He had a way of walking that matched itself to her pace without either of them ever discussing it, a way of carrying silence that did not feel empty, only companionable. And on the Sundays when the summer heat pressed down hard on the road, he would find some small thing to say that had nothing to do with anything important, a comment about a hawk circling the ridge, a remark about the Halloran mare that had thrown a shoe, small ordinary things that asked nothing of her and gave her, each time, a little more reason to look forward to the walk than she wanted to admit. The trouble that would change everything arrived not from the town's whispers, but from a man named Reuben Hargrove, who rode into Prosperity Creek on the second Sunday of July with papers in his saddlebag and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Hargrove was a debt collector out of Carson City, a lean man with a waxed mustache and manners so polished they made people nervous rather than comfortable. And he came looking for Sue Yun the day after she had walked home from church with Silas Boone at her side. "Mrs. Sue," he said, removing his hat with a small, precise bow when he found her at the counter of her shop, steam rising behind her from the washpots. "I represent the Larkin estate. Your late husband held a note with Mr. Enoch Larkin, $200, taken out 4 years past. With interest accrued, the balance now stands at $340. Sue Yun's hands stilled on the shirt she was folding. "My husband paid that note. I have seen the receipt myself." "The receipt in the Larkin ledger shows the note unpaid," Hargrove said, and set a folded paper on her counter with the gentleness of a man laying down a winning hand of cards. "I am sorry to bring such news, but the estate requires settlement within 30 days, or the note transfers to a lien against this property." He said it politely. That was what made it dangerous. A man who shouted his threats could be doubted, argued with, dismissed as a bully. A man who delivered ruin with a small bow and a soft voice left no room to fight, only to comply. Sue Yun read the paper twice after he left, standing very still at her counter while the water in the washpots went from a boil to a simmer behind her, unattended. $340 was more money than she had ever held at one time in her life. It was more than a year's earnings from the shop, most years. She thought of the deed in the trunk in the back room, the one document that made her something more than a woman scraping by on the mercy of the town, and she understood, with a coldness that settled into her stomach and did not leave, exactly what Hargrove intended to take from her if she could not produce proof he clearly did not expect her to have. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the small table in the back room of her shop with the ledger her husband had kept, searching every page by lamplight for the receipt she knew existed, The one she remembered him folding into his coat pocket the day he paid Larkin back in full. She remembered the day clearly, a spring afternoon 2 years before Winbow's death, him coming home with his shoulders looser than she had seen them in months, saying the debt was finally settled, that he could breathe now. She remembered his relief. She did not find the paper. Winbow had died of a fever 8 months after that payment, sudden and cruel, and in the scramble of grief and burial, papers had gone missing, misplaced, lost the way small things are lost when a person's whole world falls apart at once. She had packed his belongings in the numb days after the funeral without truly looking at any of it, folding shirts and stacking ledgers into trunks because her hands needed something to do while her mind refused to accept what had happened. And somewhere in that blur, the one paper that mattered most had vanished into the general wreckage of grief. She told no one in town. She could not afford to. A widow with debt trouble was a widow the town would decide had been careless with her husband's affairs, and that judgment, once made, would follow her the rest of her days in Prosperity Creek. She went about her work that week with her back straight and her face composed, taking in wash and pressing shirts and making change at her counter as though nothing at all had shifted beneath her. And only in the evenings, alone in the back room, did she allow herself to sit with the fear. But she told Silas Boone, because by the 3rd week of July she had stopped being able to carry the weight of it alone, and because some part of her, quiet and unacknowledged until that moment, had already decided he was someone she could trust with the truth. They were walking home from church, the August heat not yet arrived, but the summer sun already heavy on the road, when she said it plainly, the way she said most things. "A man came for me last week. He says my husband owed a debt that was never paid. He wants $340 in 30 days, or he takes the shop." Silas stopped walking. "Did your husband pay it?" "I believe he did. I do not have the paper to prove it." "Then we find the paper," Silas said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world, as if the whole matter were no larger than a lost glove. "We," she repeated, and something in her voice made him finally look at her directly, which he did not often do, because looking at her directly seemed to cost him something. "We've been carrying this alone since your husband died," Silas said. "I don't figure you ought to carry this alone, too." She did not answer him. But that evening, for the first time since Winbow's death, she did not lock the back room and sit with the ledger by herself. She let herself sit on the porch step instead, and watch the sun go down over the ridge, and let one single tear fall, which she wiped away before it could become two. The following Sunday, Hargrove appeared at the church service itself, standing at the back with his hat in his hands, watching the congregation with the patient look of a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the room to catch up to that fact. Sue Yun felt the eyes shift toward her the moment he stepped through the door, and beside her she felt Silas go very still, the particular stillness of a man deciding not to do something he wanted badly to do. After the service, Hargrove approached her on the church steps, in front of half the congregation, and that was when Sue Yun understood this was not a debt collection at all. This was a display. "Mrs. Sue," he said, that same small bow, "I trust you've had time to consider your options." "I am considering the fact that my husband paid this debt," she said, her voice steady though her heart was not. "I intend to find the proof." 22 days remain," Hargrove said pleasantly, and the pleasantness was the threat, and he replaced his hat and walked to his horse, while the congregation watched Sue Yun stand alone on the steps, exposed in a way she had never been exposed in 6 years in this town. Except she was not alone. Silas Boone crossed the churchyard in 4 long strides and stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, and said nothing at all, but the saying nothing was itself an answer, delivered in front of the whole town, and Prosperity Creek watched a laundry widow and a ranch hand stand together against a man from Carson City, and for the first time some of the faces watching were not unkind. "You didn't have to do that," Soo-Yoon said quietly, once Hargrove had ridden off. "I know," Silas said. "Wanted to anyway." That week they searched. Silas came to the shop each evening after his work at the Halloran Ranch was done, riding in as the sky went orange over the western ridge, and together they went through every drawer, every box, every seam pocket of Winbo Sue's old coats, looking for a receipt that seemed determined not to exist. The back room grew cluttered with open trunks and unfolded papers, and Soo-Yoon found herself, some evenings, more distracted by the quiet presence of Silas working across the table from her than by the search itself, though she did not let herself dwell too long on what that meant. Soo-Yoon told him, during those long evenings, things she had not told anyone in Prosperity Creek. She told him about San Francisco, about the ship crossing when she was 18, seasick for 11 days and too proud to admit it to the other passengers. She told him about a husband who had been kind but distant, a marriage arranged by families rather than chosen by hearts, a partnership that had been comfortable rather than passionate, built more on duty than desire. She told him she had not expected to feel much of anything when Winbo died, and had been ashamed of how true that was, until the grief arrived late and hit her harder for having been delayed, catching her by surprise months after the funeral, when she found one of his old collars in a drawer and could not stop weeping for an hour. "I did not love him the way I think a wife is meant to love a husband," she admitted one evening, folding a shirt with more attention than the task required, avoiding his eyes. "I respected him. I was grateful to him. But I do not think either of us knew until it was too late to learn whether we might have loved each other properly, given more time." Silas listened without interrupting, the way he listened to most things, and when she finished he only said, "Grief doesn't much care what shape the love was. It comes for what's lost either way." She looked up at that, surprised by the understanding in it, and something between them settled a little deeper that evening, though neither of them named it. Silas told her, in turn, about a father who had drunk himself into an early grave, and a mother who had left before Silas turned 12, about years spent moving from ranch to ranch, because staying anywhere too long meant people started asking questions about a past he did not care to discuss. Questions about why a grown man had no family to speak of, no home to return to, nothing behind him but a string of bunkhouses and broken fences mended for other men's wages. He told her he had never stayed anywhere as long as he had stayed in Prosperity Creek, going on 4 years now, and he said it like a confession, like it meant something he had not said aloud before. "Why here?" she asked him on the 5th evening of searching, when the shop was quiet and the lamp burned low between them. Silas did not answer right away. He turned a folded shirt over in his hands, though he was not really looking at it. "Reckon I had my reasons," he said finally. "Didn't know all of them myself till lately." "And now?" "Now I know one of them real well," he said, and looked at her, and this time he did not look away, and Soo-Yoon felt something in her chest that she had not let herself feel in a very long time, something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the particular warmth of being seen by someone who had chosen to look. The search wore on without success through most of that week, and worry crept back into Soo-Yoon's shoulders each time another trunk turned up empty of anything useful. On the sixth evening, exhausted and disheartened, she nearly gave up the search altogether, sitting back from the table and pressing her palms against her eyes. "There is nothing left to search," she said. "I have gone through everything he owned twice over." "Everything in this room," Silas said. "What about the old trunk in the corner, the one you haven't opened?" She glanced at it. A battered wooden chest pushed against the back wall, bound in tarnished brass, so old and unremarkable she had stopped seeing it years ago. "That belonged to his father. It crossed the ocean before either of us were born. I have never opened it. There is nothing of Winbow's business in there, only old family things." "Might be worth a look anyway," Silas said, gently, not pushing, only suggesting. And something in the quiet certainty of his voice made her rise and drag the old trunk to the center of the room. They did not find the receipt that night, but 2 evenings later, in the false bottom of that old trunk that had crossed the ocean from Canton with Winbow's own father, Su Yun found a small tin box, and inside the tin box, folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth, was the receipt, dated 4 years past, signed by Enoch Larkin himself, marking the note paid in full. She wept when she found it, not from relief alone, but from the sudden, sharp memory of her husband's careful handwriting on the note beside the signature, a note in Chinese characters she had not seen in years, reading simply, "Paid," and grateful for the trust. She recognized, too, in the careful way the tin box had been hidden, that Winbow had understood, even in his lifetime, how fragile a paper's protection could be for a woman like her, and had tried, in his quiet way, to guard it as best he knew how. Silas sat beside her while she cried, and did not try to stop her or hurry her, only stayed, his hand resting near hers on the table, close enough to be a comfort, not so close as to presume one. When her tears finally slowed, he said only, "Your husband looked after you even from the grave. That says something about the kind of man he was." "It does," she agreed, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I only wish I had known him better while he lived. I think we might have grown to love each other properly in time." "Maybe you did," Silas said, just in a quieter way than most folks expect. The next danger arrived faster than either of them expected, and larger than a debt collector's smile. Hargrove did not take the receipt gracefully. When Su Yun and Silas rode out to the small office he had set up above the assay building to present it, along with 2 witnesses from town who had agreed, reluctantly, to accompany them, Hargrove studied the paper for a long moment, and something shifted behind his polite mask. "This receipt," he said slowly, "may well be forged." "It bears Enoch Larkin's own signature," said one of the witnesses, a gray-bearded rancher named Otis Wardell, Constance's husband, who had come along more out of curiosity than conviction, but found himself, upon seeing the paper, on Su Yun's side of the matter. "I've seen that signature on a dozen contracts. That's his hand." "The estate will need to verify," Hargrove said, but his voice had lost its silk, and Su Yun understood, watching his face, that Hargrove had never expected the receipt to exist at all. He had counted on a widow with no proof and no allies, an easy debt to manufacture against a woman the town would not defend. He had not counted on Silas Boone standing at her shoulder, or on Otis Wardell recognizing a dead man's handwriting. or on the fact that Soo-Yun, after 6 years of keeping her head down, had finally stopped being willing to disappear quietly. "You will verify it today," Silas said, and his voice was quiet, the way it always was, but there was something underneath it now that made Hargrove take an involuntary step back. "Or you'll explain to the territorial marshal in Carson City why you tried to collect a debt already paid from a widow using papers you can't account for." Hargrove's composure cracked at last. "This is none of your concern, Cowboy." "Made it my concern," Silas said, "the day you stood on those church steps and tried to shame her in front of the whole town." The office fell silent for a long moment, Hargrove's eyes moving between the receipt in his hand and the two witnesses watching him, calculating, the way a man calculates when he realizes the ground beneath him has shifted. He set the paper down at last, his composure returning, but thinner now, more brittle. "I will need to send word to the estate's attorney in Carson City," he said. "This matter cannot be resolved on the spot." "Then send it," Otis Wardell said, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who had served as territorial clerk's witness on more than one occasion. "But I intend to ride to Carson City myself and see the estate's records directly. If this note was paid, as this receipt plainly shows, I expect the estate's own ledger to confirm it, once someone bothers to look properly instead of skimming past it." It was Otis Wardell in the end who tipped the balance, riding to Carson City himself 2 days later to confirm the receipt against the Larkin estate's own records that, once properly examined, showed the payment clearly logged, buried under Enoch Larkin's messy bookkeeping, and conveniently overlooked by a debt collector eager for a commission on a debt that no longer existed. Hargrove left Prosperity Creek before the week was out, and did not return. But something had shifted in the town that could not be undone by Hargrove's departure alone. The congregation that had watched Soo-Yun stand exposed on the church steps had also watched her proven right, had watched a rancher's husband ride 2 days to defend her honesty, had watched Silas Boone plant himself at her side without a single moment of hesitation. Constance Wardell, of all people, brought a jar of preserves to the shop the following week, and did not quite apologize, but did not need to. Her husband had already said enough with his ride to Carson City. "I judged you unfairly," Constance said, setting the jar on the counter with a stiffness that suggested the words did not come easily to her. "A woman ought to know her own business better than her neighbors do. I forgot that this summer." Soo-Yun accepted the preserves with a small nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Wardell. I know it was not an easy thing to say." "No," Constance admitted, "it was not." And then, because she was still Constance Wardell and could not help herself entirely, she added, "That cowboy yours rode 2 days for your honor. You'd be a fool to let him walk you home much longer without doing something about it." Soo-Yun laughed at that, surprised into it, the first real laugh Constance had ever heard from her, and something between the two women eased that afternoon that had never fully eased in 6 years of careful nodding across the street. It was in the quiet after the danger passed, on a warm evening at the end of July, that Silas said the thing he had been carrying since March. They were sitting on the porch step of her shop, the tin box with the receipt safely returned to its trunk, the ledger closed for the first time in weeks without dread attached to it. Soo-Yun had brought out 2 cups of tea, and the evening was soft and gold, the kind of evening that made a person believe, briefly, that trouble might actually be over. "I ought to tell you something," Silas said, turning his hat over in his hands the way he did when he was working up to a thing. "You do not need to work up to it," Soo-Yun said. "You have never needed to work up to anything with me." He laughed, short and surprised, and set the hat aside. "Fair enough." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "I've walked you home every Sunday since April because I wanted an excuse to be near you. Wasn't ever really about the walking." "I know," she said. "You know." "Silas Boone, I have known since the second Sunday." She smiled, the first easy smile he had seen from her in weeks. "I let you keep believing you were fooling me because I did not know what to do with the knowing." "And now?" "Now," she said, and set down her tea, "I believe I have stopped being confused about it." He reached over and took her hand, the first time he had done so without the excuse of crisis or danger to justify it, and her hand did not pull away, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because there are things a hand held in an evening light can say that words only get in the way of. "I'm not a rich man," Silas said eventually. "Never will be, likely. Ranch wages and a bad leg don't add up to much." "I did not ask you what you had," Su-Yun said. "I am asking what kind of man you are. I already have my answer." They sat together on that porch step until the light was nearly gone from the sky, talking of small things now, the way people talk once the largest fear between them has finally been named and set down. Su-Yun found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, imagining a future that did not consist solely of survival, of steady work and careful independence, but of something warmer, something shared. August arrived hot and dry, and with it came a second, smaller trial that Su-Yun had not anticipated. A woman newly arrived in town, a widow herself named Priscilla Toft, who had taken a room at the Wardell boarding house, made it known within her first week that she considered it improper for a respectable cowboy to be courting what she called, within earshot of half the mercantile, a foreign widow, when there were suitable women of his own kind available to him. Silas heard of the remark within a day, as such remarks always traveled fast in a town the size of Prosperity Creek, and he did not raise his voice or make a scene of it. He simply walked into the boarding house parlor that evening, where Priscilla Toft sat with her needlework, and said, plainly and without heat, that Su-Yun Su was the finest woman he had ever known, and that anyone in Prosperity Creek who felt otherwise was welcome to say so to his face rather than behind her back. Priscilla Toft did not repeat the remark again, and Constance Wardell, who had overheard the whole exchange from the hallway, told the story to no fewer than 6 women over the following week, each time ending it with the same satisfied observation, that Silas Boone had more backbone than most men twice his standing in town, and that Su-Yun Su was a fool if she let him get away. Su-Yun was not a fool. 3 months passed after that evening on the porch step, and Prosperity Creek watched the two of them the way it had always watched them, but the watching had changed its character entirely. By October the leaves along the creek had turned, and the debt to the Larkin estate was a settled matter, filed and closed in the territorial records in Carson City, and Su-Yun's laundry shop had grown busier than it had ever been, in part because half the town now made a point of bringing their business to the widow who had stood her ground against a Carson City debt collector and won. She hired a second pair of hands that autumn, a quiet young woman named Faith Calloway, who had lost her own husband to a mining accident the year before, and the two of them worked well together, the shop humming with a kind of steady prosperity Su-Yun had not known since her earliest hopeful months in Prosperity Creek. Silas had left the Halloran Ranch that autumn, not because of any trouble there, but because Otis Wardell, grateful in his own quiet way for having been part of setting things right, had offered him a share in a small horse-breeding operation on land bordering his own, an offer that came with modest pay, but real ownership, the first real ownership Silas Boone had held in his life. He took to the work with the same steady competence he brought to everything, and by the time the first frost came to Prosperity Creek, he had 3 mares in foal and a small herd that was, in every sense that mattered to a man who had spent his whole life working other men's land, entirely his own. They married in November, in the same small clapboard church where he had first fallen into step beside her, in front of a congregation that had, in the space of one long summer, gone from watching Sue Yun with suspicion to watching her, on her wedding day, with something closer to affection. Constance Wardell wept openly through the ceremony, which surprised no one more than Constance herself. Otis Wardell stood near the front, with the quiet pride of a man who had ridden 2 days on a stranger's behalf and never once regretted it. She wore the gray Chong Sam, the same one she had worn every Sunday that summer, because Silas had asked her to, saying it was the dress he had fallen for her in, and he did not intend to marry any other version of her. "You keep walking me home," she said to him again, on the road back from the church that November afternoon, his hand in hers, the whole town having just watched them exchange vows before God and witnesses. "Maybe I like the company," Silas said, exactly as he had said it that first Sunday in June, and this time there was no question in her voice when she laughed, only the easy, settled sound of a woman who had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, because the man beside her had already proven, in every way that mattered, that he intended to stay. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.